Chapter 6, Mishnah 3. In the previous Mishnah, we learned that everyone agrees that a limb removed from a living person is tameh. This Mishnah discusses the status of a piece of flesh or bone that comes off such a limb. A kazayas of flesh that comes from a limb removed from a living person. Rabbi Eliezer rules that it is tameh, just like flesh that comes from a corpse. But Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nechunya rule that it is tahor, like flesh that comes from a living person. A piece of bone the size of a barley corn that comes from a limb removed from a living person. Rabbi Nechunya rules that it is tameh, just like the bone from a corpse. But Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua rule that it is tahor, like the bone removed from a living person. To summarize, there are three opinions about flesh and bone that come from a limb removed from a living person. 1. Rabbi Eliezer holds that the flesh is tameh, but the bone is tahor. 2. Rabbi Nechunya holds the opposite. The flesh is tahor, but the bone is tameh. 3. Rabbi Yeshua holds that both the flesh and the bone are tahor. The Mishnah now records the discussions between these Tanaim about their views. It begins with Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Nechunya questioning Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. They, Rabbi Nechunya and Rabbi Yeshua, said to Rabbi Eliezer, "What reason did you see to make tameh a kazayas of flesh that comes from a limb removed from a living person?" He said to them, "My reason is that we find that a limb from a living person is treated like a complete corpse with regard to the laws of Tumah. Just as a complete corpse is tameh and transmits Tumah even through Ohel, so too a limb from a living person is tameh and transmits Tumah through Ohel. It therefore follows that just as in the case of a corpse, the law is that a kazayas of flesh that comes from it is tameh, so too with a limb removed from a living person, the law should be that a kazayas of flesh that comes from it is tameh." The other Tanaim respond. They said to Rabbi Eliezer, "No, your comparison is faulty. If you consider a kazayas of flesh that comes from a corpse to be tameh, this is because you consider a bone the size of a barley corn that comes from a corpse to be tameh. That is, since we see that the Torah was strict with a bone coming from a corpse, it makes sense that the Torah was also strict with flesh that comes from a corpse. Will you make tameh on this basis a kazayas of flesh that comes from a limb removed from a living person, where you rule that a bone the size of a barley corn that comes from such a limb is tahor? Since even you, Rabbi Eliezer, agree that a limb from a living person is treated more leniently in regard to a bone that comes from it, perhaps the Torah was also more lenient in regard to flesh that comes from it, and considers it tahor as well." Rabbi Nechunya's opinion is now questioned. They, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua, said to Rabbi Nechunya, "What reason did you see to make tameh a bone the size of a barley corn that comes from a limb removed from a living person?" He said to them, "My reason is that we find that a limb from a living person is treated like a complete corpse with regard to the laws of Tumah. It therefore follows that just as in the case of a corpse, the law is that a bone the size of a barley corn that comes from it is tameh, so too with a limb removed from a living person, the law should be that a bone the size of a barley corn that comes from it is tameh." The other Tanaim reject Rabbi Nechunya's opinion with the same type of argument that was used to reject Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. They said to him, "No, your comparison is faulty. If you consider a bone the size of a barley corn that comes from a corpse to be tameh, this is because you consider a kazayas of flesh that comes from it to be tameh. Since we see that the Torah was strict with flesh that comes from a corpse, it makes sense that the Torah was also strict with the bone that comes from a corpse. Will you make tameh on this basis a bone the size of a barley corn that comes from a limb removed from a living person, where you rule that a kazayas of flesh that comes from such a limb is tahor? Since even you, Rabbi Nechunya, agree that a limb from a living person is treated more leniently by the Torah in regard to flesh, perhaps the Torah was also more lenient about it in regard to a bone that comes from it, and considers it too tahor." After presenting similar arguments and rejections of the opinions of both Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Nechunya, the Mishnah explains why each of them thought his case was different. They said to Rabbi Eliezer, "What reason did you see to divide your method of comparison and say that we compare a limb from a living person to a corpse, but only in regard to its flesh and not in regard to its bones? Either rule that both of them are tameh, or rule that both of them are tahor." He said to them, "We find that the tumah of flesh is greater than the tumah of bones. For flesh is subject to tumah even in the case of nevelos and shiratzim, which is not the case with bones. The bones of nevelos and shiratzim are not tameh. Since flesh is a source of tumah in regard to other types of tumah, whereas bones are not, it makes sense to compare the tumah of a limb to that of a corpse only in regard to its flesh and not in regard to its bones." Rabbi Eliezer finds an additional difference between the tumah of flesh and the tumah of bones. This serves to strengthen his opinion that the tumah of flesh is more severe, and only it should be compared to a corpse. An additional point, the tumah of flesh is also greater than that of bones in the following way. A limb from a living person that has a proper amount of flesh on it transmits tumah through touching, carrying, and through ohel. Now, a limb must consist of bone, flesh, and sinew. Nevertheless, if some of the flesh is missing, it is still considered a limb, and it is tameh as long as enough flesh remains for it to be able to heal. However, if some of the bone of the limb is missing, it is no longer considered a limb, and it is tahor. We see from this too that flesh is treated more strictly than bones. Rabbi Nechunya's opinion is now explained. They, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, said to Rabbi Nechunya, what reason did you see to divide your method of comparison and say that we compare a limb from a living person to a corpse, but only in regard to its bone and not in regard to its flesh? Either rule that both of them are tameh or rule that both of them are tahor. He said to them, we find that the tumah of bones is greater than the tumah of flesh. For flesh that comes from a living person is tahor, but a limb that comes from him, and it is in its original form, i.e. it has flesh, sinew, and bone, is tameh. Since flesh alone is not tameh, but when combined with the bone it is tameh, we see that the bone is the main cause of tumah. Since bones have this stringency over flesh, it makes sense to say that the law for bones that come from a limb is stricter than the law for flesh that comes from a limb. Rabbi Nechunya cites a second way in which bones are a greater source of tumah than flesh. An additional point, the tumah of bones is greater than the tumah of flesh in the following way. A kazayas of flesh from a corpse transmits tumah through touching, carrying, and ohel. And similarly, a majority of the bones of a corpse transmit tumah through touching, carrying, and ohel. However, when these amounts are not met, the law of flesh and the law of bones are not the same. If some of the flesh is missing and what remains is less than a kazayis, it is completely tahor and does not transmit tumah in any way. On the other hand, if some of the majority of bones is missing so that there is no longer a majority, even though the bones that remain are tahor with respect to transmitting tumah through ohel, they still transmit tumah through touching and carrying. Therefore, when it comes to flesh and bones that come from the limb of a living person, we are also more strict with bones and consider them tameh, and are more lenient with flesh and consider it tahor. Rabbi Nechunya presents yet a third way in which bones are a greater source of tumah than flesh. An additional point, the tumah of bones is also greater than the tumah of flesh in the following way. The flesh of an entire corpse that measures less than a kazayis is tahor even if all of it is present. However, with regard to bones, if the bones that form the majority of the structure of a corpse are present, or if a majority of the total number of bones in a corpse are present, then even though those bones do not add up to the measure of a quarter kav needed to transmit tumah through ohel, they are still tameh and transmit tumah through ohel. Thus, flesh lacking the proper measure is tahor, even if all the flesh of the corpse is present, while bones lacking their proper measure are tameh, as long as a majority of them are present. Again, we see that bones have a greater power to transmit tumah than flesh. It therefore makes sense to say that we are stricter with bones that come from the limb of a living person and consider them tameh than we are with flesh that comes from the limb, which is tahor. Rabbi Yeshua's opinion is now analyzed. They, Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Nechunya, said to Rabbi Yeshua, what reason did you see to consider both of them tahor? Since a limb removed from a living person is tameh like a corpse and transmits tumah through ohel, it is logical to compare the flesh and bone that come from it to the flesh and bone that come from a corpse. He said to them, no, your comparison is faulty. If you say regarding a corpse that the flesh and bones that come from it are tameh, this is because a corpse has the following stringencies. A majority of its bones, a quarter kav of its bones, and even its corpse dust, the dust of a corpse that has decomposed, transmit tumah through ohel. Since we see that the Torah treated a corpse very stringently and gave it the power to transmit tumah through ohel, even through these collections of its parts, it makes sense that it also gave it the power to transmit tumah to the flesh and bone that have been removed from it. Will you say that the same must be true for the flesh and bone that come from the limb of a living person, which does not have the law that a majority of its bones, a quarter kav of its bones, and its corpse dust transmit tumah through ohel? Since it is clear that the Torah does not treat the tumah of a limb from a living person as strictly as it does the tumah of a corpse, we have no right to assume that a limb from a living person has any of the additional stringencies we find by a corpse. such as having the flesh and bone that come from it also transmit tuma.